All right. So thanks for being here. I'm Lewis Maverick Adams on behalf of the Ether Vector, a think tank, lab, and fund where we build the frameworks and operating technologies of tomorrow, test them in our lab, and facilitate or directly fund those buildouts. What we're going to talk about today is a concept that is one of the most underestimated strategic levers a large institution has: location strategy. Where you put things, where you build, where you grow, where you pull back. But here's the thing. I've spent years at the intersection of this inside global banks, at KPMG, working with energy firms, biotech companies, life sciences organizations. And what I found is that location strategy is one of the most underestimated strategic levers a large institution has. Most organizations treat it as a real estate decision: find a site, sign a lease, move some people, and that framing costs them enormously because the real frame is that location is a system, a network of interdependent decisions about where you produce value, where you access talent, where you manage risk. And increasingly, with the rise of artificial intelligence, where you optimize all of it simultaneously. So today, we're going to move through that progression. We'll start with the traditional view. Then we'll get into what it actually looks like inside a large, complex institution. We'll anchor it in a real story from inside one of the biggest banks in the world. And then we'll move into how artificial intelligence is fundamentally changing this discipline across banking, energy, utilities, biotech, life sciences. If you're a strategy leader, a real estate executive, a workforce planner, or honestly, anyone who's ever had to decide where something should happen, I think this is going to be useful. So let's dive in. So, when most people hear the phrase location strategy, they think retail, they think a 5 mile radius around a branch or a store, maybe 10 miles if you're being generous. And that's not wrong, it's just incomplete because location strategy in its fullest form is really about answering three questions simultaneously. The first question: where do your customers come from? That's the traditional trade area question. It's about demand, it's about catchment, it's about geographic footprint in the market. The second question: where does your institution produce value? That's a very different question. And most organizations never ask it this way because value doesn't only come from customers, it comes from operations, from talent, from risk management, infrastructure, from the decision systems that sit underneath everything. And then the third question, and this is the one that changes everything: how do you optimize both of those simultaneously at scale? That is location strategy. Not just the 5 mile radius, not just the lease decision, the full system of where an institution produces and captures value. Now, think about this through the lens of a large bank. A global institution operates in hundreds of markets simultaneously. Retail branches on the customer facing side, operation centers, technology hubs, risk management facilities, back office processing on the internal side. And historically, those two worlds, the customer facing world and the operational world, were were managed almost entirely separately. Different teams, different budgets, different frameworks. What we've learned is that when you bring them together and model them as a single integrated network, the strategic leverage is enormous. That's the shift. That's what we're going to unpack today. Let me make this real for a second. At a global financial institution I worked at, we had what were called service centers: Tampa, Dallas, New York, Heredia, Costa Rica. And on paper, it looked simple. Move roles out of high cost environments like New York into lower cost locations. Tampa, Costa Rica, classic labor arbitrage, cost reduction, scale, efficiency. That's the story you tell on a slide deck. But that's not what we were actually doing. What we were doing was redesigning the global operating system of the bank. We were asking questions that went much deeper than cost. We were asking, where can we access the right talent at scale and sustain it over time? Where can we maintain operational control and regulatory integrity simultaneously? Where can we manage costs without degrading the quality of the work being done? And then once we had answers to those questions, we were redistributing work accordingly. So Tampa wasn't just cheaper than New York. Tampa was a deep operational talent pool, scalable workforce infrastructure, strong domestic regulatory alignment. And it sat in a time zone that worked for the whole US operation. Dallas, similar profile, but with a different economic composition. New York State. And this is the part people missed. We didn't exit New York because New York isn't about cost. New York is about proximity, proximity to leadership, to decision making, to regulators, to strategic stakeholders. There are things that happen in New York that simply can't happen anywhere else at the same level of intensity. And Heredia, Costa Rica, which is interesting because people tend to frame that as labor arbitrage. It's not. It's system design, capital humano de alta. You're accessing a workforce that is educated, multilingual, and operationally aligned. So when you look at all four of those locations together, what you're really looking at is not a list of offices. You're looking at a deliberately engineered capability network. Each node was different. Each node was serving a distinct function within the larger system. And the strategy was to balance the enterprise across all of them. Now, here's the reframe I want to offer. because I think this is the insight most practitioners miss. We've talked a lot about trade areas in the context of customers, but what I want to introduce is a different concept: capability catchments. Just as a trade area describes the geographic footprint from which a location draws customers, a capability catchment describes the geographic footprint from which a location draws operating capacity, talent, institutional knowledge, regulatory infrastructure, technology depth. And when you start modeling your enterprise through this lens, the strategic picture changes completely. Take New York. The capability catchment of New York isn't just a 5-mile radius. It's the entire ecosystem of global financial infrastructure that exists in that city. The regulatory bodies, the institutional counterparts, the talent pipeline from Ivy League universities, the density of experienced professionals in every area: risk, legal, compliance, strategy, project management, program management. That's a catchment. And it has enormous strategic value, but it comes at a cost. Tampa's capability catchment looks completely different. Mid cost, deep operational workforce, strong universities producing process oriented talent, a labor market that refreshes at a different pace than New York. And that's the strategic complement to New York. You don't pick one or the other, you design the system to leverage both. What's interesting is this same concept applies on the customer side. Banks manage customer trade areas where deposits come from, where lending demand is concentrated, where digital adoption is the highest versus branch visits, where branch visits still matter. And they manage internal capability catchments, where the operations happen, where the talent lives, where the decisions get made. A mature location strategy manages both simultaneously. And the institutions that do this well don't just save money on real estate, they build a structural competitive advantage. They can scale faster, they can access talent others can't, they can manage regulatory exposure more effectively, and they can respond to market changes with a level of agility that their competitors simply don't have. That's the power of thinking and capability networks rather than single locations. And that framework is what artificial intelligence is now supercharging. Now, here's where it gets really interesting because everything I've described so far, the service centers, the capability catchments, the balancing of the enterprise across cost curves and talent markets, uh, all of that was done historically in a very manual way. We had periodic reviews, we had annual planning cycles, and of course, spreadsheets with hundreds of rows of data manually assembled by analysts. Decisions made on lagging indicators, data that was sometimes 6 months old by the time it reached the executive making the call. I mean, we made good decisions that way, but we were always making decisions with incomplete information at insufficient speed and with really limited ability to model second order effects. And this is the shift. This is where AI changes the game, not incrementally, but structurally. Let me walk through what the modern AI enabled approach to location strategy actually looks like in practice. Because there's a lot of noise in the market right now about AI for everything. And I want to be specific, I want to be grounded. The way leading organizations are building this capability is as a decision stack, as a governed decision stack, not one model, not a black box, a stack of interconnected tools that work together. The first layer is spatial analytics. This is the foundation, geocoding your assets, building trade areas, computing drive times and accessibility, layering in demographics, competitor data, mobility patterns. This has been around for a while. GIS technology, S3, platforms like that. But the data inputs have become dramatically richer. Real time mobility data, foot traffic signals, transaction level behavioral data. A bank like Regions, for example, used location analytics to scenario test branch network changes against low and moderate income census tracts in near real time, so that before any closure decision was made, they could immediately see the community impact. That's a compliance capability and a strategic one. The strategic layer, the second layer is geo AI, geospatial machine learning. This is where it gets sophisticated. You're no longer just drawing circles on a map, you're training models that learn spatial relationships, neighborhood characteristics, demand patterns, talent density, risk exposure from heterogeneous data sources simultaneously. Models that can identify latent geographic similarity beyond administrative boundaries. So instead of saying this is a high income zip code, you're saying this microgeography has been a pattern we've seen succeed in 12 other markets for these specific reasons. That's a fundamentally different level of insight. The third layer is demand forecasting. For branch networks, visit volume, deposit balances, new account acquisition. For workforce planning, talent availability by geography, attrition, risk by market productivity differentials across locations. For hybrid work scenarios, commute friction, utilization rates, return to office patterns by city and by function. And these forecasts are no longer point in time estimates, they're continuously refreshed as new data flows in. The fourth layer, and this is where strategy becomes action, is optimization. Given everything the models tell us, what should we actually do? Which branches open? Which to consolidate? Where do we build the next service center? Which geographies do we exit? And critically, in banking, which decisions pass the regulatory and fairness test? Because here's something I want to be clear about. AI doesn't make these decisions. In a regulated environment, and banking is one of the most regulated on the planet, the human remains in the loop. The models inform, the models surface trade offs, the models quantify risk and opportunity with a precision that wasn't previously possible. But the executive, the risk committee, the governance body, they own the decision. And the model output has to be explainable. It has to be auditable. It has to hold up to regulatory scrutiny. The Fed's SR 11.7 guidance on model risk management is essentially a blueprint for how this works in banking. So, what you end up with is not a set it and forget it AI system. What you end up with is a decision support infrastructure that makes every location decision faster, more defensible, and more strategically aligned than what was possible before. And what used to be location strategy becomes a living system of capital allocation. Now, this isn't just a banking story. The the same framework, capability catchments, AI enabled decision stacks, continuous optimization is playing out across every regulated infrastructure heavy industry. Let me walk through two of them, starting with biotech and life sciences. In biotech and life sciences, location strategy shows up in a few distinct forms. The most visible is clinical development, selecting countries and sites for clinical trials. Think about what that decision actually involves. You need to find the right patient populations. You need geographic proximity to clinical investigators with the right expertise. You need to operate within the regulatory frameworks of each country. GCP compliance, electronic records requirements, data integrity standards. And you need to forecast recruitment velocity because a trial that recruits too slowly is a trial that runs over budget, misses competitive windows, and in the worst case, threatens the viability of the program. AI is now being used to model all of this simultaneously, predicting patient recruitment by geography, identifying trial sites with the historical track record and infrastructure to execute, aligning trial locations with the talent ecosystems of leading research institutions, and flagging regulatory complexity by jurisdiction before you commit. There's also the manufacturing and distribution dimension. Where do you site a manufacturing facility? That's a location decision that involves proximity to raw materials and suppliers, access to a highly skilled workforce, regulatory environment, FDA inspection history, local compliance infrastructure, and increasingly, and this is an area I know a lot about, supply chain resilience. The clusters are well known: Boston, San Diego, the Research Triangle, and North Carolina. But the question now is, how do you model emerging clusters? How do you identify the next talent ecosystem before your competitors do? And this is where the geo AI layer becomes particularly powerful in life sciences because the signals are there. University research output, National Institute of Health funding patterns, venture capital investment flows, talent migration data. You can triangulate those systems into a forward looking view of where the next high value capability catchment is. That's not theoretical. That's happening in the leading biotech organizations right now, two of which I'm providing advisory services for. Different industries, same underlying problem. Where do you place critical capability under constraint? And this is the shift into energy and utilities, which is, I think, one of the most fascinating applications of this framework. In energy and utilities, the equivalent of a service center, it's not an office, it's a grid node or an operations hub or a substation. And the catchment area is defined not by customer demographics or talent pools, even, but by low demand, infrastructure proximity, workforce availability for field operations, and increasingly climate risk. That last one is new and it's changing everything because when you're citing grid infrastructure today, you're not just asking where's the demand, you're asking where will the demand be in 20 years? and what's the wildfire risk at that location, and what's the flood exposure, and how does that interact with our transmission routing. AI is being used to layer all of those signals together, optimize where grid investments go, predict demand surges from EV adoption, data center growth, manufacturing reshoring, allocate field crews dynamically based on real time outage patterns and weather forecasts. And there is a direct regulatory analog here. Just like banking has the Fed and the OCC, energy and utilities, they operate under FERC, NERC, and state level public utilities commission. The NERC CIP standards, which govern critical infrastructure protection, create an auditability requirement that mirrors SR 11.7 in banking. You can't just optimize. You have to document the optimization. You have to demonstrate it was done within established governance parameters. Same concept, different asset class, different regulatory framework, but the underlying discipline is the same. And this is what I find compelling about this whole space. Whether you're talking about a bank branch network or a utility grid or a clinical trial portfolio, the strategic problem is structurally identical. You have a network of assets, you have a set of external demand signals or indicators, you have internal capability constraints, and you're trying to optimize continuously across all of it. So let me pull this together because I think there is a deeper pattern here, one that goes beyond any single industry. Across all of the examples we've discussed, banking, energy, biotech, life sciences, we are witnessing the same fundamental shift. We are moving from static geography based decisions that are made periodically and based on historical data by small teams with limited computational tools. We're moving to a dynamic, a system based optimization of different dimensions of talent, of cost, of risk, and performance. All of this is continuously refreshed. And it's refreshed with AI enabled tools that can model complexity that was previously intractable. But here's what I want to be careful about because I've seen this play out in practice. The organizations that get into trouble with AI in location strategy are the ones that move too fast, the ones that skip the governance layer, the ones that treat the model output as the decision rather than rather than as input to the decision. The maturity progression in leading organizations looks a bit like this. First, you move from maps to models. You replace spreadsheet scoring with actual predictive models. You build a rigorous data foundation. You start measuring outcomes. Then you move from models to optimization. You add the optimization layer, scenario planning, portfolio analysis, trade off quantification. And finally, and this is the horizon that most organizations are working toward, you move toward adaptive systems, where the network itself is continuously recalibrated, not once a year and not once every quarter, but continuously. But, and this is critical, In regulated industries, adaptive does not mean autonomous. Human accountability still matters and it still remains. The risk committee still owns the decision. The executive still signs off. The model is the instrument. The human is the pilot. And that framing is the one I would encourage every leader in this space to hold on to. AI, artificial intelligence, amplifies judgment. It does not at all replace it. So, when we talk about location strategy, we're not really talking about circles on a map. We are talking about where and how an institution produces value, where it accesses talent that others simply can't, and where it manages risk in ways that build trust with regulators and stakeholders, where it positions itself for the next decade of growth, and increasingly systems of intelligence, not just the next lease cycle. The leaders who understand this stop thinking about location as a place and start thinking about it as a network, a system, an engine, and the AI tools that are now available to us, they don't change what we're trying to do. They change how precisely we can do it. They give us speed. They give us clarity. They give us the ability to model trade offs that used to require years of experience to even see clearly. Well, here's what I'll leave you with. Trade areas were the language of the past. Capability networks are the language of the future. And the institutions that learn to speak that language fluently, they will have a structural advantage that compounds over time like compounding interest. I'm Lewis Maverick Adams of the Aether Vector. Thank you for joining Season 2, Episode 1. So long, and thanks for being here.